2905 Before the siege. Cassie left the part of Mordred trapped inside the mirror in a pitiful state, crumbled on the floor and crying. She would have liked to share parting words, but sadly, he was in no condition to hold a conversation. It was no surprise. After all, the King of Nothing could only endure the weight of his memories because he knew no regret, and therefore no remorse, no compassion. His other self, however, empty as he was, knew compassion all too well. To him, the memories of all the gruesome things Mordred had perpetrated, as well as all the ghastly things Mordred had endured, were like poison. Experiencing them as memories was no different from torture. One he had chosen for himself, but torture nonetheless. So, Cassie simply left. She wasn't feeling all too well, either. The next day, she tied a piece of fabric around Rain's face, covering her eyes, and helped her push Smile of Heaven's wheelchair to the highest floor of the Ebony Tower, past the hall where the walls were carved with myriad runes. What is so dangerous about those runes, anyway? Rain's voice was subdued. Cassie lingered with the answer. There are things in this world that will destroy you simply by knowing them, or even by being too close to those places where the knowledge of them was transcribed. There is also knowledge that was forbidden by the will of the gods. Actually, the runic hall of the Ebony Tower is not too dangerous, at least not to an ascended like you. But, she hesitated. Most awakened are protected from understanding the forbidden runes, and therefore gaining knowledge that will destroy them, by the spell. But you are not a carrier of the spell, so nothing is protecting you. More than that, you are exceptionally sensitive to the names and, by extension, to the runes. Places like this are dangerous to you, Rain, at least until you grow stronger. Smile of Heaven remained still and expressionless as her wheelchair floated up the stairs, held up in the air by the power of Rain's epithets. Finally leaving the eerie level behind, they arrived at the highest floor, where the portal archway rested in the darkness. Rain removed the piece of fabric from her eyes and sighed. So, what is the plan? If things go south, we open the portal and run away again. Cassie remained silent for a while, then slowly shook her head. No, there's nowhere left to run. You won't be able to open the portal again, anyway. Turning slightly, she pointed to the runic circle surrounding the archway. See there, a portion of the enchantment is destroyed. I destroyed it. You should recognize the runes I crossed out. Space, desire, web, connection. I taught you these runes already. Rain did not answer immediately. Why did you destroy the runes? Cassie pushed the wheelchair away from the entrance to the stairwell and turned to face her. Because now that the Ivory Island is back among the Chained Isles, anyone can use it to gain entrance here. I had to make sure that we won't be attacked from inside the Ebony Tower, so I chose to destroy the runes that you can restore one day. Just in case I am not here to help you. She seemed at ease, and her voice was as calm as ever. Rain simply stared at her for a long while, trying to keep her own emotions under control. Eventually, she asked, "What am I supposed to do here, then?" "Just wait and listen, wondering what is happening outside." Cassie offered her a reassuring smile. "This is the safest place in the tower. Here, nothing will happen to you during the battle. If the battle drags for too long, there is food, blankets. Everything you need to spend a few days in relative comfort." Rain raised her chin a little. "What about after the battle? What happens if I stay safe and sound while everyone else dies?" Cassie seemed to study her for a moment. "Well, I don't think anything terrible will happen. The Dreamspawn needs as many people as possible to stay alive and well, especially powerful awakened like you. So, you will probably have to spend a few more months under his mind hex, then, Sunny will come back and find a way to break it." Rain shook her head. "You just called me a powerful awakened. So, you should let me stay with you and help." She gritted her teeth. "You said that you needed my help, that you needed me to be your eyes. Who is going to be your eyes if I'm here?" Cassie smiled gently. "Rain, it will be hard even for me to be of any use in this battle. A master like you won't be able to change a new thing. Plus, you are already helping. Haven't you given me the epithets? I can feel them. I am much stronger because of you." Her gentle words were in sharp contrast with her pale face and the blood seeping through her blindfold. Rain bit her lip, then turned away and faced the obsidian wall. After a while, she spoke again, her voice tone. "I've been trying out my ascended ability, you know. I've been trying to talk to the Ebony Tower." Cassie tilted her head a little. "Oh, did it say anything?" Rain hesitated for a few moments, then shrugged. "It is not really a conversation. But I can feel something." An impression, like hearing an echo of the thoughts that belonged to a sleeping giant. She turned slightly and said, "This tower was flawlessly white once, you know. Just like its sister high in the sky. But after myriad years of burning, it turned black, like the darkness around it." Cassie smiled. It must be glad to be here in the sky above, then, bathed in the light and caressed by the winds. Rain turned to the wall once again and shook her head slowly. After a while, she said, "It misses the fire." Cassie tilted her head. Eventually, she walked up to Rain and gripped her shoulder softly. Then, she turned away and left. Now alone, Cassie slowly descended the steps of an ancient black tower. With each step, a dull pain radiated from beneath her bloodied blindfold. All around her, Mordred's vessels were preparing to face the final siege of the war, even if they had little chance of winning it. She passed the hall where the forbidden runes were inscribed on the walls, the shrine of the goddess of black skies, the workshop of The Demon of Destiny, the great brazier where the flame that had once destroyed the kingdom of hope still burned, and the living quarters on the ground floor as well. Walking out of the ebony tower, Cassie faced the familiar expanse of the chained island. Out there, separated from the flying island by a vast chasm and the great length of 7 celestial chains, these once forged by humans, not by the mythical beings of the distant past, the forces of humanity were arrayed against her and Mordred. The great army of the Hunger Domain was positioned on the islands around the Ebony Tower, surrounding it from all sides. Hundreds of thousands of awakened, thousands of masters, more than 100 saints, there were vast swarms of echoes and myriad enthralled nightmare creatures, as well. Seishan and her sisters were among them. So were Nightwalker and the Saints of Night, Skytide and Roan, even her own firekeepers. And their master, of course, their new master, that was Astarion. All of them were ready to attack the Ebony Tower. Quite a sight, isn't it? She turned her head slightly, acknowledging the man who had spoken to her, the wicked monster with eyes that reflected the world back on itself. Mordred of Nowhere, the king of nothing. Her last and only ally. Cassie lingered for a moment, then said, "Evenly, I wouldn't know." Mordred laughed. Once the echoes of his laughter were swallowed by the wind, he added in a mocking tone. "It all could have been avoided if you had let me loose, you know. Ah, but alas, you and your senseless morality. If the rulers of the Longing Domain had been willing to let him cull humanity before Astarion took it, they would not have been driven into a corner. The Dreamspawn would not have become unstoppable." Mordred paused briefly, looking at the enthralled army that had belonged to the obliterated Longing Domain once, and asked, "So, what does defeat taste like?" Cassie lingered for a long time. When she finally spoke, her dark voice was full of defiance. "I am not defeated yet. 2,906 behind enemy lines. At the same time, far away, cold winds were assaulting the world, and a murderous blizzard was raging across a desolate wasteland. Far in the distance, the outskirts of a tall mountain chain were barely visible, rising above the horizon like a thin black line. They were shrouded in clouds of ash that rose from the depths of ancient volcanoes, their boundless heat keeping the blizzard at bay. There were the lands west of Ravenheart, where lethal cold reigned. On the very edge of the frigid wasteland, a chain of outposts had been built from ice, guarding the lands of the humans from the beings that dwelled in the snow. They had been home to transient garrisons of awakened warriors and sheltered the scouts who would dive into the blizzards from time to time, but now, the ice stronghold stood empty and forlorn, dead silence shrouding their battlements. Everyone had answered the call of war and followed their golden-eyed sovereign east, abandoning the defensive line of outposts that used to protect the citadel cities from harm. Now, only snow and wind moved inside the abandoned fortresses. And the creatures that they had been supposed to stop moved between them, traveling toward where human souls emanated a maddening scent. A swarm of such creatures had just passed through a desolate army camp, bringing the blizzard with them. The snow flowed with the swift wind, and the abominations moved under its veil. None of them made it in sight of a human settlement, though. Instead, they died unseen and unnoticed, the blizzard hiding their corpses while the winds drowned out their death cries. Soon enough, a scattering of ghastly corpses was being slowly buried by the snow. Eerily enough, the corpses bore no wounds, no visible signs of having been harmed by claw or by a weapon. It was as if their lives had simply ceased, extinguished by the hand of a merciless deity. But no one seemed to be around. Unless one looked really closely. The blizzard raged, and in the swirling drifts of snow, a ghostly figure could sometimes be seen, walking east with measured steps. Its contour was drawn not by the snow, but by its absence. Apart from that negative presence, nothing betrayed its existence. Not breath, not warmth, not heartbeat, and not the sounds of her steps. The ghostly figure belonged to a woman with blue eyes who carried a black scythe in her hands. Stopping for a short moment, Jet assumed her human form and inhaled deeply, enjoying the vicious bite of the murderous cold. Her hair was in disarray, and her armor was tattered. Snow and ice clung to her like a frigid cloak, and her porcelain skin was as white as the snow that surrounded her. There was no color to her bloodless face, except for her eyes, which burned like two piercing, ferocious blue flames in the pale inferno. Jet looked like a corpse, or perhaps like death itself. However, she was undoubtedly alive, as far as that word could be applied to her, at least. Having entered the frozen wastelands from the forgotten shore, she dove into the blizzard in order to hunt down snow wraiths and survive. The world was enveloped in snow, and since the sky was hidden from sight, she quickly lost track of time. Day and night lost all meaning, and after a while, time lost all meaning as well. All Jet could use to differentiate the past from the present was the number of fierce battles she had fought and the number of vicious nightmare creatures she killed. But even then, she eventually lost count. The world narrowed to the extent she could see in the blizzard, and the scope of her life narrowed to only two things: hunting down nightmare creatures and being hunted by nightmare creatures in turn. There were moments that broke the murderous monotony, of course. Sometimes, the blizzard would die down all of a sudden, and Jet would see the flawlessly white world stretch endlessly in all directions. Sometimes, the ground beneath her would crack, and she would realize that she was walking across a frozen ocean. Harrowing things dwelled beneath the titanic layer of ice, and she would flee from the deep cracks, terrified to sense the giant beings watching her from below. There were only two constants in that stark and harrowing white void. One was the suffocating, deadly cold. The other was the hollow mountains. The hollow mountains were to her left, shrouded in white mist. At times, the mist and the blizzard were almost indistinguishable from each other, but in reality, there was little in common between the two. The snow was murderous, but the mist far more dangerous. So, Jet avoided drawing too close to the hollow mountains as she traveled west. Jet did not have a lot to do, except for killing and surviving, so she set a goal for herself. She wanted to find where the hollow mountains ended. And now, gods knew how many weeks or months later, she had arrived at the outer edges of the human territories from the west. She had discovered the termination point of the mountain chain that had seemed endless, crossed to the other side, and made her way back to human civilization. I can't believe I actually made it. Jet had somehow managed to achieve her goal. So, now, she looked east, where a different mountain chain rested under an ashen sky. Where Ravenheart was. Releasing her corporeal form, Jet continued moving east. I've been gone long enough. Now, it's time to see what they did to the world in my absence. Somewhere else, in a dark cell, Effie opened her eyes. They were slow to focus, but eventually, she could see again. It was just that what she saw was the same stone ceiling as before. For however long she had been in the dungeons of the castle. Ah, I'm awake. What a pity. She had been dreaming the sweet East Street dream. And then, she dreamed a terrifying nightmare. But even the nightmare was better than her current circumstances. Effie sighed. At least I am not hungry. I'm not hungry anymore. She didn't feel hungry, indeed. However, that wasn't because she was full. On the contrary, her body was a gaunt wreck. She looked like an emaciated corpse, so thin and frail that anyone would feel nauseated by looking at her. Effie herself was not that appalled by her current state, though, because it was a familiar one. She had not looked much different for most of her life, bound to a wheelchair and wasting away in a world that was not too kind even to healthy people, let alone cripples like her. She didn't feel hungry simply because her body had moved past hunger. Instead, she felt apathetic and terribly tired, so weak that even the weight of the chains binding her limbs made it seem like she couldn't move. Her mind was enveloped in fog, and her thoughts were slow and disjointed. What was I dreaming about? That comfortable state was the body's response to starvation. After subjecting a person to the maddening, irresistible desire to find sustenance and the excruciating pain of extreme hunger, the body chose to conserve what little energy it had left and entered a state of lethargy. Effie was familiar with that lethargy, as well. She had seen it happen countless times in the outer settlement of the Bright Castle. Usually, its arrival meant that the starving sleeper would die soon. Of course, she wasn't lucky enough to die. The dream spawn was not going to let her die, which meant that someone would come to feed her a few morsels soon. Then, the madness and pain would begin anew. She just hoped that Astarion would not send her husband again. No, wait, what was I dreaming about? Slowly, the details of her dream surfaced in her foggy mind. It was then that Effie finally moved, making the chains rattle. Straining her emaciated body, she slowly sat up. The weight of the chains felt crushing, but she still forced herself to move, pushing herself into a semblance of a vertical position. The length of her chains was not generous. Effie couldn't really stand up, and she could barely sit. Both of her legs and both of her arms were shackled, each chain connected to one of the four walls of her cell. Because of that, she couldn't exert her strength fully, couldn't find purchase to pull on the chains and tear them out of the ancient stone, destroying what Mirage had once imagined. Why would a demon need a dungeon, anyway? What kind of things had that strange girl fantasized about? Then again, it wasn't Mirage who had fashioned this underground chamber into a cell, most likely. It had probably been someone from the clan Valor. Those guys were great masters of creating ghastly things. Had been great masters. Almost all of them were gone, now. Effie drew in a hoarse breath. That dream. She had dreamed of being free. Effie tried to smile, a weak laugh escaping from between her cracked lips. Free, free. Wouldn't it be nice, to be free? Effie had also dreamed of the Ebony Tower being besieged. If the war had really entered the final stage, then the Dreamspawn must have summoned away most of the awakened in Bastion. She swayed slightly. Ah, damn it, maybe no one was coming to feed her, after all. 2907 Hell of Ariel. As the great army of the Hunger Domain moved forward to attack the Ebony Island, somewhere far away, the darkness was torn apart by blinding flashes of stark light. The shadows moved erratically as they danced on the sand walls of a colossal tunnel. The chaos was permeated by an unbearable heat, and countless figures were intertwined in a gruesome battle. The rustling roar of shifting sand and the deafening clangor of the furious melee were like a devastating force, growing more and more violent as they echoed and spread across the tunnel. Sunny could barely hear any of it, though, because all he could hear was the call of nightmare. Ah, stumbling, he leaned on the sand wall of the tunnel. I just can't. The pull of the call was maddening. It was vast like the sky and deep as an ocean, almost impossible to resist, assaulting his mind like a virulent roar. It was overwhelming, overbearing, unendurable. Sunny could not hear himself think. He could barely think, really. In his mind, there was only the roaring need to answer the call, a deep and unimpeachable necessity to be embraced by the nightmare. A skeletal hand broke through the sand wall of the tunnel, clawing at his throat. Growling, Sunny snatched it in the air and pulled the deathless warrior out of the sand, crushing his skull with an armored fist. Of course, that did not slow down the undead. Bastard one bit. Full of demented frenzy, Sunny tore the skeleton's arms from their sockets, threw him to the ground, and stomped the deathless warrior into a pile of bone fragments. At the same time, he manifested towering pillars out of shadows, using them as support beams to prevent the wall of the tunnel from collapsing. Damn it all, Sunny looked around, trying to evaluate the situation through the maddening haze veiling his mind. The remains of the Shadow Legion and the undead army of Azarax were besieged from all sides as they moved forward through the colossal tunnel. The tunnel itself was located deep underground, having been dug by Abundance. The Godworm itself was currently some distance ahead of them, moving through the sand as they followed behind. Abundance created the tunnel, while Sunny collapsed it once their dwindling expedition force moved past a section. That way, the endless horde of the Deathless pursuing them could only attack the invaders after pushing their way through the compacted sand. The benefit of that strategy was that only so many undead horrors could attack them at the same time. Its pitfall, though, was that the Deathless attacked from all directions, left, right, above, below. Abundance itself was nearly destroyed by now, as well, which meant that they were not going to be able to hide from the Deathless horde underground for much longer. We need to return to the surface. Tormented by the call, Sunny looked up. His eyes were full of both hope and trepidation. He was hopeful because they must have made it terribly close to the tomb of Ariel, by now, perhaps even close enough to enter it and escape the endless battle against the Deathless. He was full of fear for the same reason, since getting even closer to the Great Pyramid meant that the call would grow even more unbearable. Sunny, we need to ascend. Neff's voice broke through the thunderous cacophony of the battle, sounding distant and strained. He took a step back, avoiding a forest of skeletal hands that burst through the sand to grab his legs, and groaned. Ascend, ascend. Their army was in a desperate state. Weeks had already passed since the battle against the Wandering Archon. That horror was not the only deathless spirit they had faced. There had been others, as well. Some had been human once, others had been sacred beasts. All were nearly impossible to defeat, so Sunny and Neffes had to invent ways of escaping them instead. They made it closer and closer to the tomb of Ariel, often surviving by the skin of their teeth or by a miracle, and it was not without a cost. By now, the Shadow Legion was practically eradicated. Most of Sunny's shades had been vanquished and were now being slowly mended in his soul. Only a few of the strongest remained, as well as a handful of those he had never seen a reason to summon. Saint had received so much damage that her tenebrous armor was failing to repair itself in time. So, this was the first time Sunny saw her fight without the fearsome onyx carapace, her jade skin shining like precious stone under the blinding sunlight. Slayer was in the shape of an enormous black lioness, covered in ghastly wounds and surrounded by a mantle of grey smoke. She was at the head of the battle formation, rampaging among the deathless like a berserk beast made of cold, malevolent darkness. Serpent was currently coiled around Sunny's body as an intricate tattoo, augmenting him while remaining safely removed from the possibility of being destroyed. Nephis, meanwhile, was nearing the state of essence exhaustion. She only possessed 3 soul cores now, having burned the other 4 to ash in order to bring them this far. Azarax, the ancient tyrant, had been forgetting more of himself on the way to the tomb of Ariel, slowly losing the ability to speak and reason with others, but he had emerged from this ghastly death march relatively unscathed. If anything, his power was far greater now than it had been at the start of their journey. There were thousands of undead warriors following him by now, some of them powerful enough to give even Sunny and Nephis pause. In fact, the slowly growing deathless army was the main reason they had been able to reach the innermost region of Ariel's hell, serving as a moving armor for the remains of the Shadow Legion. No. There were too few shades left to call that a defensive formation. In truth, the Deathless Army was now the main and only fighting force of their daring expedition, not counting Nephis and Sunny themselves. Of course, as well as his shadows. Ascend. Yes, there was no other choice but to ascend. This strategy of moving underground had served them well for a while, but now, the disparity in numbers between the invaders and the Deathless was far too great. So, this tunnel would soon turn into a death trap instead of making them safer. Okay, Sunny gave Abundance the command to move toward the surface. Soon enough, the dunes of Ariel's hell moved like a swelling sea and collapsed, revealing a titanic maw that rose from beneath the endless expanse of white sand. A colossal worm with hide as black as the night sky above it crawled onto the surface of the desert and collapsed heavily, a storm of gray smoke surrounding its enormous mass. Its anthracite hide was cut and torn apart in countless places, ghastly wounds littering the gargantuan expanse of what was left of the godworm's body, at least of the length of it visible above the sands. These wounds were so dire that the sacred shade did not seem capable of sustaining its integrity anymore, collapsing slowly into a tide of darkness. Just a few moments after breaching the surface of hell, the shape of Abundance crumbled, dissolving into nothingness. And a few moments later, a furious torrent of white flame shot into the sky from the enormous chasm left in its wake, incinerating the Deathless rushing toward the entrance to the endless tunnel. The warriors of Azarax followed, advancing across the incandescent expanse of molten sand that was already turning into obsidian glass. They pushed the Deathless back, creating a narrow beachhead for the remnants of the Shadow Legion to escape the tunnel. That was when Sunny climbed to the surface and froze, stunned by what he saw. The endless expanse of the tomb of Ariel that loomed above him, obscuring half of the world, so close that it almost seemed like he could reach forward and touch it. We made it. No sooner had he said it than the call of nightmare descended upon him like a tidal wave. Sunny let out a groan, staggering, looking at the Great Pyramid while an unexplainable horror took hold of his heart. Somber and wreathed in darkness, the tomb of Ariel rose from a sea of flawlessly white sand like a towering mountain. Its slopes were like vast plains, and its sharp peak was like a spear that pierced the heavens. Outlined against the backdrop of the starlit sky, the pyramid was like a black rift in the fabric of the world. Its edifice was built from millions of colossal stone blocks. Each block was darker than the darkness itself and perfectly aligned, leaving no gaps between them. And each of them was a seed of nightmare. There were millions of them, some already in bloom, some still waiting for their turn to blossom. At the base of the pyramid, the nightmares were shallow and weak. Higher, they were traumatic and unfathomable. And higher still, the slope of the colossal pyramid was broken and covered in cracks, with many blocks either shattered into dismal dust or missing. 4 vast scars were tainting its immaculate surface, as if some unholy beast had torn through the eternal stone with titanic claws. And higher still, suddenly, something cool covered his eyes. It was Neff's hand that reached from behind to prevent him from seeing. Sunny, Sunny. Her whisper was hoarse and full of fear. Don't look, Sunny, you mustn't. He remained motionless for a few moments, trying to gather his crumbling thoughts. Neffes. Neffes was afraid. What could have? He tensed. Why? What's there? She remained silent for a long while. When she eventually spoke, her quiet voice was trembling. Doom. 2908 Doom. Sunny lost track of time for a few moments. He just stood there, breathing heavily, drowning in the call and in the peculiar, all-consuming terror that had been born somewhere in the depths of his being and washed over him like a tide. He did not know the source of that terror or why he was overcome by it, which only made him more afraid. What people feared the most was the unknown, after all. Sunny had long grown unaccustomed to the feeling of fear, so experiencing it now was strange and eerie. Eventually, he managed to compose himself a little, enough to prevent himself from falling to his knees and crawling toward the Great Pyramid, at least, overwhelmed by the desire to come in contact with the nightmare seeds. Sunny drew in a shaky breath. What do you mean? What is it, Neff? She was still covering his eyes to preventing him from beholding the top of the tomb of Ariel, she whispered. It's the end. Sunny was starting to feel concerned because of how Neffes was behaving. He had never seen her that afraid. In fact, he did not think that he had ever seen her show fear at all. The end of what? The answer came after a few long, frightening seconds. The end of everything. Raising his own hand, he placed it atop Neff's and gripped it faintly. You are not making any sense, Neff. Please, explain it to me, so that I can understand. Behind him, Neffes inhaled deeply, remained silent for a while, and then began talking. At the very top of the pyramid, there is a capstone. Just like all the other blocks it was built from, the capstone is a seed. A seed of nightmare. Sunny nodded slowly. But there are millions of seeds here. What makes this one so special? Behind him, Neffes shook her head and spoke in a low tone. No, Sunny, you don't understand. There are no seeds in existence like this one. There can't be. He frowned, trying to decipher her words. All seeds of nightmare were unique, so what made this one so singular? The seeds on the bottom of the tomb of Ariel were of a low rank, while those higher up its immense expanse were more harrowing. The highest one, then. Before Sunny could finish the thought, Neffes said quietly. It's the last one. No, it's the first one. Sunny, it's the seed of the nightmare spell. Her voice turned into a whisper. It's the seed of the seventh nightmare. Sunny froze, losing the sense of time once again. Seed of the seventh. The deep shock of those words shut down his mind for a few heartbeats. Or possibly an eternity, he couldn't tell. No, wait, it was too much, to be ambushed by that knowledge out of nowhere. Sunny was already straining to stay sane in the ocean of the call, standing at the doorstep of the tomb of Ariel, in the heart of an endless hell, waging a war against a cursed legion of ancient warriors whom Shadow God had banished from death. What business did the seed of the seventh nightmare, the source of all other seeds, as well as the root of the nightmare spell, have here, as well? They had never expected to find it here. They had not even considered the possibility, let alone set it as their goal. The seventh nightmare was the nightmare of the forgotten god, in which he was imprisoned. His consciousness was, at least. Sunny shuddered, but then, peculiarly enough, he calmed down. Well, it had to be somewhere, I suppose. He had assumed that the seed of the seventh nightmare was in the heart of the Shadow Realm, where the Void Gate stood, and where Weaver had died, ushering in the age of the nightmare spell. But in hindsight, there was no indication that it was there. Looking back, there were some other clues that could have helped him realize the truth. But then again, everything seemed clearer in retrospect. Like the fact that his mind had refused to fathom the capstone of the tomb of Ariel when he briefly saw it in the vision at the start of the third nightmare. Come to think of it, that was where the vision had shattered. It had stopped abruptly as soon as his gaze fell on the sharp peak of the Great Pyramid. The very fact that every stone of the tomb of Ariel was a seed of nightmare should have told him something. Why had he never questioned how it was possible for a single structure to give birth to so many nightmares? And the butterflies, the dark butterflies. The nightmare butterflies, an inconceivable swarm of them nesting on the inner walls of the pyramid, millions of great abominations, or possibly more. Why had he not questioned what they were doing there, and how they came to be? Now that he knew more, he could offer a theory. These peculiar abominations had to be feeding on the emanations of the innumerable nightmares, using them for sustenance. He was on the precipice of constructing another theory, as well, a theory about why Weaver chose the tomb of Ariel as the place where the seed of the nightmare spell would take root. No, now is not the time to go on a tangent, Sunny. The battle was still raging around them. They had reached the tomb of Ariel, but making it inside was a different matter entirely. And they had just discovered the source of all nightmares, by the dead gods. They were standing in sight of the closest approximation of a true god left in existence, of a seed where the spirit of the last surviving god, the forgotten god, was trapped. Well, Nephis was in sight of it. Sunny currently had his eyes covered. Why was she covering his eyes, anyway? Sunny's hand fell down. The answer was pretty obvious. It was because Nephis possessed the longing attribute and was immune to corruption, while he wasn't. Gazing upon the source of the nightmare was not much different from gazing directly into the void. One glance, and his soul could very well bloom with the vile, virulent darkness of the corruption. I won't look, I promise. Nephis, you can lower your hand. However, she only let him go after tearing a strip of fabric off her tunic and tying it around his eyes. Sunny caught his breath, trying to evaluate the situation. Azarax, Saint, and Slayer seemed to be holding the Deathless back, for now, and just barely. He could already sense the torrents of will shifting, which was an ill omen here in the Nightmare Desert. It meant that a deathless spirit was approaching, or possibly even a few of them. Sunny and Nephis had to make it inside the tomb of Ariel quickly. However, that was a problem in and of itself. There was surely a way inside the Great Pyramid. After all, the people led by the Sibyls had reached the Great River somehow at the height of the Doom War. Darren and his champions made it inside, as well. And so did Sunny and Nephis, in the future, tonight. Even if they had not reached that future just yet. But even if they had, Sunny still had to find an entrance soon. How do we get inside? Neph's shadow shifted as she glanced up, almost taking a step back as a result. After a short stretch of silence, she said, "Up there, close to the top of the pyramid, where it is marked by claw marks. That is where the stone we used to enter the third nightmare had come from, most likely. The scars left on its surface run deep, so there must be a path inside one of the marks." Sunny hesitated for a moment. "You want us to climb to the top, close to that seed?" He wasn't sure that it was a wise idea. Nephis shook her head. "We can't climb the pyramid. If we touch the lesser seeds, I will be eventually drawn into a nightmare, while you will be killed or corrupted. So, we will have to fly." Sunny nodded. "Then it's time to summon back the chain breaker." As soon as the words left his mouth, he froze for a brief moment. He realized that the pieces of the puzzle were aligning perfectly to repeat the future they had experienced in the third nightmare. Did it matter, though? At the moment, it did not matter at all. The chain breaker was their best chance of getting into the tomb of Ariel without ever touching its walls, so that was what they were going to use to get there. "I will help Azarax hold the Deathless back while you draw it from your soul sea and prepare it to take air. Then, we'll. Sunny's voice trailed off, and then he fell silent. In fact, everything fell silent. The world was suddenly quiet and peaceful, the clangor of battle entirely gone. That was because there was no battle anymore. Turning away from the tomb of Ariel, Sunny relied on his shadow sense to perceive the world. What he sensed made him shiver. The Deathless were retreating. In fact, if he did not know any better, he would have said that they were running. What? Why are they? All that remained on the white sands in front of the tomb of Ariel were Nephis, Sunny and his shadows, the pitiful remains of the Shadow Legion, and Azarax at the head of his undead army. The Deathless were terrifying, but somehow, their absence frightened Sunny much more. What are they running from? It was then that he felt it. The shadows. Countless shadows were separating from the boundless form of the Great Pyramid, and moving swiftly in their direction. 2,909 dark clouds. The Deathless were retreating from the tomb of Ariel, leaving a vast swath of the desert around it empty. Now, only the remnants of the invading army were left on the white sand in front of the towering black edifice of the Great Pyramid. Azarax and his undead warriors grew still, a sea of them facing the vast expanse of Ariel's hell. The scattering of battered shades was still slowly moving away from the mouth of the enormous tunnel, led by Saint. In the pale radiance of the distant stars, her eerily gorgeous face was still and emotionless, her flawlessly white stone-like skin smeared with ruby dust. Slayer was apart from everyone, still in the form of a grotesque lioness, her sable fur darker than the night. Her hide was covered in ghastly wounds, and she was breathing heavily, shrouded in a mantle of ghostly fog. Sunny shivered and turned to the tomb of Ariel, sensing a terrifying swarm of shadows escaping from it into the night sky. Nephis. She must have sensed it, as well. As she looked up, he could feel her tensing. "What is it?" After a long moment of silence, she said in a distant tone. "There are clouds obscuring the sky. Then, she exhaled slowly and outstretched a hand, summoning the blessing. No. Those aren't clouds. They are butterflies. The nightmare butterflies, thousands of them, perhaps tens of thousands. Maybe more. Sunny suppressed a groan. Tens of thousands of great beasts and monsters, at least. Millions of them had been nestling inside the pyramid in the third nightmare, so the clouds Nephi spoke of could spread to devour the entire hell of Ariel. The entire dream realm, even. This night just keeps getting better. He gritted his teeth. The nightmare butterflies were already moving down from the great height of the Black Pyramid, rushing toward them like a dark tide. He couldn't see them, since his eyes were still covered, but he could feel the terrifying movement of their shadows. The dreadful swarm had been summoned by the alluring scent of human souls. Supreme souls that were burning with the flame of divinity. We can't defeat them all. He hesitated, and then said quietly. We need to escape. We need to escape into the tomb of Ariel. That was the only way. There were probably more nightmare butterflies inside the pyramid than there were outside. However, when Sunny and Nephi sailed the Great River, only a couple of them had ever descended from the inner walls of the tomb to the endlessly flowing waters below. So if they managed to reach the river, then, perhaps, they would be safe from the nightmarish swarm. Sunny turned to Nephi's briefly and spoke in an even tone. Summon the chain breaker. The ship will be destroyed if we simply dive into a sea of great monsters, so somebody will have to clear a path through the swarm. Saint will steer it, while the rest of us will defend it. You will have to take point, Nephis. Azarax and I will help however we can. Nephis had been weakened by the loss of the longing domain and was merely a supreme demon now, but she was still the best person for the job. She excelled at aerial combat, as well as at fighting against vast groups of enemies. So, even if Sunny and Azarax were stronger at the moment, she could do to the swarm of nightmare butterflies what they couldn't. The seventh seed or not, they still had to survive. They still had to accomplish their mission. The seed. Sunny was distracted for a moment, almost succumbing to the maddening call. If the seventh seed crowned the tomb of Ariel, the tomb where oblivion had been buried, then the one on the moon had to be the seed of the sixth nightmare. The final nightmare one had to conquer in order to become divine. The path to seed of the fifth nightmare, meanwhile, was hidden in America. So, the road to the end of all of this was already revealed. Or, at least, to the end that Nephis envisioned and wanted to reach. Sunny himself still believed that the last nightmare they had to conquer was the sixth one, and that they had no reason to risk everything for an ambiguous payout after becoming divine. Becoming divine, after all, would allow them to face unholy nightmare creatures in battle. And that was all they needed to ensure the survival of humanity in the dream realm for thousands of years to come. The gods, who had been by their nature void creatures, were dead. The last of them was imprisoned by the nightmare spell. So unless a swarm of new void creatures broke through the cage of existence or the nightmare spell started showing signs of coming undone, he saw no reason to tempt fate. It was pure folly, but, still, the nightmare, it called for him. Its call was so sweet. Get a grip. Sunny shook off his reverie. I'll get Azarax. Go. As the graceful form of the chain breaker slowly revealed itself above the white sand, he turned away from the tomb of Ariel and rushed toward the undead army. Saint, get the oars. Abandoning the remnants of the Shadow Legion, Saint crouched slightly and then leapt high into the air. Her garments and hair whipped in the wind as she breached a great distance with that single leap, landing on the deck of the chain breaker like a jade goddess. Nephis was already soaring into the sky to meet the terrifying swarm of nightmare butterflies, her wings and the blade of the blessing shining blindingly in the darkness of the night. Sunny was summoning somebody to help them, as well. The last sacred shade he could summon, at the moment. Abundance had just been destroyed, returning into the nurturing darkness of his soul. The wolf had long been mended, and then vanquished again, several times over. So was the Rat King. However, the puppeteer remained. And who better to send into a terrifying aerial battle than the shadow of a sacred moth? Come to think of it, Slayer had some winged beasts in her repertoire of forms, as well. Slayer, help Nephis. Decimate those butterflies. On the white sands of the desert, an enormous black lioness raised its head and looked up, cold malice slowly igniting in her lightless eyes. Sunny finally reached the deathless army. Hey, Fossil, Azarax, we need to. His voice trailed off. Something was off. The ancient tyrant was standing with his back to Sunny, his towering figure still encased in the heavy armor made of glass. His bones were entirely black now, just like those of the rest of the deathless. His soldiers were facing away from the tomb of Ariel, as well, as if watching their retreating kin. They were too motionless, too still, and something about the way their tyrant's shoulders were set that gave Sunny a peculiar, unfamiliar feeling. Hey, Azarax, answer me, damn it. Sunny pulled the improvised blindfold off his eyes, tied roughly around his wrist, and looked at the deathless sovereign. There were a few moments of silence. Then, Azarax turned slowly and gazed at him, a cold and unfeeling kind of darkness nestling in the deep chasm of his empty eye sockets. There was something eerie about that darkness now, something Sunny did not recognize. No, there was a lack of something, rather. Azarax had been slowly losing himself over these endless, dreadful weeks. But now, it was as if he was utterly gone. As if his mind had been entirely consumed by the curse, leaving behind only malevolent will. Sunny took a step back. Crap, Azarax the Mighty, the Plague of Steel, the conqueror of 100 thrones, had finally succumbed to the curse of Shadow God. He chose the worst possible moment to do that, as well. As if brought back to life by Sunny's call, the deathless warriors of the cursed tyrant moved. Their rusty blades flashed, slaughtering the few remaining shades. Azarax himself, meanwhile, raised his fearsome battle axe and walked toward Sunny across the white sand, his steps making the desert shake. Sunny took another step back. Damn it, I knew. His voice was full of indignation. Behind him, the chain breaker was rising into the air, and an apocalyptic swarm of great abominations was descending upon it. I knew this would happen. Sunny gritted his teeth, knowing that he had to hold Azarax back, somehow. Now that the Plague of Steel had become an enemy, he was quite terrifying. Sunny was outraged. He was appalled. He was really quite incensed. I really didn't want to do this. 2910 Burning Heaven. Having vanquished the battered shades, the Deathless stayed back as Azarax marched across the desert toward Sunny. It seemed that even consumed by the curse of Shadow God, the Plague of Steel remained true to his nature. He didn't want to kill Sunny, he wanted to defeat him, trample upon him, and therefore make him a vassal. To add the Lord of Shadows to his ever-growing army. Sunny took another step back and forced out a smile. You know, there are a myriad of great abominations barreling this way right this moment. If you are so tough, why don't you try subjugating them, instead? Azarax did not respond, was incapable of responding anymore, and simply continued forward with heavy, confident steps. Suspended inside the glass carapace, his black skull wore a menacing grin. Sunny cursed. I guess not. He stopped backing away and remained motionless for a moment, his head lowered, glaring at Azarax with angry scorn. I knew this would happen, you know. Well, actually, I didn't know, but I had a feeling that it would. So, I've been racking my brain thinking how to get rid of you this whole time. Actually, I've been considering how I would destroy you from the very moment Nephis took you off that tree. The sacred tree. Sunny laughed bitterly. But you know what? It is very difficult to get rid of a supreme. So, I came up empty. There's no sure way to obliterate the great Azarax, the Plague of Steel, so, I guess an unsure way will have to do. In the next moment, the ancient tyrant was upon him. Manifesting the serpent in the form of a black Odachi to block a world-shattering blow, Sunny shouted. Slayer, what the hell are you waiting for? Do you need a special invitation? Go. Behind him, Nephis was seconds away from clashing with the first of innumerable nightmare butterflies. Her radiant wings opened as if trying to embrace the night sky, and then the blessing flashed like a white rift in the dark tapestry of the night sky. Nephis shot past the enormous butterfly without ever slowing down, and behind her, the smoldering corpse of the great monster fell apart, cut cleanly in two. The dark cloud of the harrowing swarm was almost upon her. Neph's eyes blazed with white radiance, and she cried out the names, channeling the annihilating inferno of soul flame to devastate her enemies. A thunderous explosion shattered the sky, and a vast, fierce conflagration of white flame suddenly bloomed in the middle of the boundless swarm of night-mare butterflies. Many of them were immediately turned to ash or torn apart, causing a rain of burning flesh to fall to the ground. That was not the end of it, though. Following the first, another explosion roared almost immediately, and suddenly, the darkness of the night was chased away. The vast cloud of great monsters was illuminated from within, as if a star had been born among them. Then, the fire spread, carried by the wind as it jumped from one butterfly to another, incinerating their wings. It was as if a tidal wave of fire was spreading across the burning heavens. Finally, Nephis was inside the swarm. The blessing moved, its blade turning into a radiant ray of pure light that spanned thousands of meters in length. It sliced apart a dozen ghastly abominations, their fetid blood evaporating as soon as it touched the radiant blade. This kind of battle was the kind of battle where Nephis could truly shine. She had sacrificed 4 of her 7 cores to get their expedition this far into the desert. But now that scores of great abominations were dying to her flame, a tidal wave of soul fragments flowed into her soul. New soul cores were going to be formed from those fragments soon, and when they did, she would be able to destroy them again. By burning her soul cores to ash, Nephis would be able to slay even more nightmare creatures, which in turn would provide her with more soul fragments. As long as she endured the harrowing pain of her flaw and the harrowing agony of another soul core being formed within her soul, and as long as she wasn't killed in one blow by one of the innumerable nightmare butterflies, she would be able to continue in the same way. Like a true titan battling a vast swarm of lesser creatures. Sadly, the swarm of nightmare butterflies was too great and too terrifying, even for her to handle alone. But she wasn't alone. Nephis moved in the sky ahead and to the left of the slowly rising chain breaker. Ahead and to the right of the graceful vessel, meanwhile, a titanic moth whose wings spanned several kilometers was moving toward the falling cloud of giant butterflies. Each of the great abominations was at least 100 meters in size, their wings blotting out the stars, but the shadow of the spirit of doubt easily dwarfed them with its sheer mass. The puppeteer was not that outstanding when it came to physical violence and direct combat. However, that was only in comparison to the cursed ones. Against great nightmare creatures, the gigantic shade was a natural disaster. Seconds before the looming figure of the titanic moth dove into the expanding cloud of nightmare butterflies, innumerable threads of black silk suddenly shot outward from its body, piercing the abominations and shredding their wings. In the next moment, a cataclysmic clash thundered like the roar of an inconceivable storm, raising a hurricane so powerful that it reshaped the sea of dunes below. But even then, it was not enough. With Nephis moving like a storm of flame within the swarm and the puppeteer engaging its expanse in ferocious combat, too many nightmare butterflies were still making it past them. They were already moving toward the chain breaker, where Saint stood alone, holding the steering oars with her alabaster hands. That was when Slayer finally entered the battle. Standing there on the sand, the tenebrous lioness let out a low growl. Then, it took a step forward, the billowing mantle of gray smoke moving around her. With each step, the form of the lioness changed, growing vague and uncertain. Then, it became obscured by the fog completely. And then, something gargantuan and terrifying moved inside the fog. A towering foot that ended with razor-sharp claws descended upon the sand, making the ground quake. Then another, a reptilian body covered in obsidian scales was slowly revealed, great black wings opening to encompass the heavens. Atop a long neck, a bestial head was crowned by twin ridges of twisting horns, 2 enormous eyes were narrowed like slits, their vertical pupils burning with chilling malice. A long tail whipped in the air, obliterating a towering dune. It was a dragon, a great obsidian dragon, surrounded by a tattered mantle of ghostly smoke, raised its head to the sky and opened its maw, revealing 2 rows of terrifying fangs. Its thunderous, deafening roar made the winds themselves falter and die. Raising a hurricane with a single flap of her wings, Slayer rose into the sky. She rose like a dark tide, rapidly catching up with the chain breaker. And before the nightmare butterflies reached it, a great torrent of lightless black flame poured out of her maw, engulfing them all and leaving no trace of their profane existence. 2911 Mind Killer. While Nephis, Slayer, and the puppeteer engaged the nightmare swarm in the vast darkness of the sky, Sunny faced the deathless sovereign, Azarax, in the heart of hell. The blade of the soul serpent endured the devastating blow of the cursed tyrant's fearsome glass axe, but just barely. The world itself seemed to crumble from the harrowing force of that blow, and the dunes around them collapsed, shattered by the violent shockwave. The hurricane wind raised countless tons of sand into the air, obscuring the sky, just like the vast swarm of the nightmare butterflies obscured the cold, distant stars. It was as if a great sandstorm had suddenly descended upon Ariel's hell, veiling the world. Sunny, who had been caught in the epicenter of the cataclysmic impact, was thrown back by the ferocious blow. Damn, he had made himself as heavy as a mountain, but even so, his body shot through the air like a bullet. The moment he hit the sand, another impact thundered, making the desert quake. The pauldron of his jade armor cracked, but his tenacious bones endured. He was still rolling across the sand when Slayer clashed with the terrifying swarm of great monsters. Struggling to stand up, Sunny briefly allowed himself to look up, careful not to let his gaze wander too high, where the 7th seed rested atop the Great Pyramid. Watching the malevolent obsidian dragon slaughter the nightmare butterflies, he felt indignant for a moment. When the hell did she manage to kill a dragon? Slayer's transformation ability allowed her to assume the forms of all beasts she had killed, which meant that once upon a time, she had hunted down and killed a dragon. Kai had competition now. Then again, this was Slayer he was talking about. In hindsight, it would have been stranger if she had not killed a dragon or two. Still, how come I'm the only one who has never slain a dragon? What's up with that? That's not. Before Sunny could finish the thought, he felt a cold chill on his neck. He ducked without even thinking about it, and a split second later, the blade of an axe flashed through the space where his neck had been. Azarax was already looming above him, his vague figure towering like a black cliff in the fierce sandstorm. Having failed to behead Sunny, he struck him in the chest with the butt of the great axe in the same motion. The vicious force of that blow made Sunny groan and stagger back, but a split second later, the blade of the axe was already flying at his head. All he could do was retreat and defend himself, his bones groaning as the impenetrable carapace of the jade mantle cracked and slowly crumbled from the terrifying force of the impacts. What the hell? There was just no way to defeat Azarax in combat. He was simply too strong, having been turned into a walking calamity by a profane combination of his aspect and thousands of years spent waging war. Even augmented by all his shadows, Sunny was weaker than the Deathless Sovereign. Even empowered by all the shades of his domain, he could not overcome his tyrannical will. Even while using the Shadow Dance, he could not contend against thousands of years of battle experience that Azarax had accumulated over his long life of unceasing conquest and slaughter. And if Sunny failed to hold him back, the monstrous demigod would easily split the chain breaker in two with one swipe of his terrifying battle axe. No distance would stop him from delivering the blow, and the nightmare butterflies would not stop him either. That was something Sunny knew in his heart without needing any proof. Luckily, holding The Deathless Sovereign back was all Sunny had to do. Defeating him would doubtlessly feel great, but alas, there was no time or opportunity for that. Damn bastard. Sunny finally managed to evade a lethal blow swiftly enough to leap back and create a little bit of distance between himself and Azarax. The towering Deathless straightened, turning the eerie gaze of his empty eye sockets to Sunny, and took a step in his direction. At the same time, his will attacked the world around them with vicious intensity, mangling the space to prevent Sunny from escaping and help Azarax reach him in one step. Sunny, naturally, used his own will to prevent that from happening, or at least slow the ancient tyrant down. He took a step back. Then, he took another. Azarax was almost upon him by then, his army of undead warriors following them through the sandstorm. Sunny gritted his teeth and took a third step. At the same time, he began to summon one of the few shades that remained. In his soul sea, unscathed. A fourth step, one of Sun Yu's incarnation separated from him and disappeared into the sandstorm. The fifth step, Azarax lunged forward, breaching the remaining distance between them with impossible speed. The sixth step, the fearsome battle axe soared into the air, ready to plunge down and split Sunny from head to toe. The seventh step, Sunny stopped. Hey, bastard. He raised his serpentine odachi, as if ready to defend himself again. Look behind you. And it was then that Azarax stumbled. The Deathless Sovereign came to a halt, his shoulders trembling faintly. The darkness nestling in his empty eye sockets moved, and he turned to look back slowly. As if overcome by a sudden, inescapable fear. And there, half obscured by the raging sandstorm, a colossal tree towered above him, its branches stretching far and wide. Its bark was black as onyx, while its beautiful leaves were even darker than that, darker than the velvet expanse of the night sky, dark as the starless void above the forgotten shore. That was the shade of the Soul Devourer, of course, the shadow of the corrupted sacred tree that Sunny had burned to ash once, and which usually remained in the peaceful darkness of his lightless soul, its branches swaying lightly above the courtyard of the nameless temple. The soul-devouring tree had been a fallen terror when Sunny destroyed it. A fallen terror was not something that could seriously threaten a supreme, of course, especially a supreme like Azarax, the Plague of Steel. But the memory of spending thousands of years nailed to a sacred tree, POWERLESS, defeated, unable to escape. That was enough to rattle him. That was enough to shake his uncompromising, tyrannical will. To put a crack into it, however briefly. The Soul Devourer was not just any shade, it was the shadow of what Azarax dreaded most, even if he was not willing to admit it. It was his own personal nightmare. And the Deathless Sovereign was forced to face that terrifying nightmare in the shadow of the tomb of Ariel, the great pyramid that the demon of dread built in the heart of the hell he had created. Where all nightmares were born. If that was not enough to give Azarax pause, Sunny did not know what was. Giving him pause was not the extent of what Sunny wanted to do, of course. What he wanted to do was buy himself time. So, while Azarax was briefly frozen in place by the ominous visage of the soul-devouring tree, Sunny stepped into the shadows and appeared near it, using all 6 of his remaining incarnations to wrap it into his dark embrace. Suddenly, the Soul Devourer was empowered and augmented by 6 supreme avatars of the Lord of Shadows, of the Sovereign of Death. Its branches swayed lightly, a myriad of beautiful black leaves rustling quietly, yet drowning out the deafening howling of the wind. And then, myriad chains forged from shadows and infused with supreme essence shot from the colossal figure of the soul-devouring tree, the Death Tree, flying toward Azarax and his deathless Warriors. The ancient tyrant finally shook off his paralysis, moving to evade the chains flying at him, but it was too late. They bound him like hungry snakes and dragged him toward the trunk of the Soul Devourer, just as his deathless warriors were being bound and hung from its vast branches. Soon, thousands of blackened skeletons were hanging from the branches of the death tree like macabre fruit, straining hopelessly to break free. Their jaws were hanging open, as if open in silent screams. The black leaves of the terrifying death tree swayed like an ocean of rustling darkness. 2912 Next worst option. The monarch of the cursed warriors, the deathless sovereign himself, was bound to the death tree's colossal trunk, wrapped in myriad chains. His struggles were the most furious, the chains snapping and shattering as more and more of them were manifested from the deep darkness at the roots of the Soul Devourer to replace them. The eerie shade was already working its vile magic, poisoning the minds of the deathless. However, even augmented by 6 incarnations of its master, it could not handle the boundless will of Azarax, the plague of steel. Unseen, his will crashed into the trunk of the colossal tree, aiming to break and shatter it. Of course, what it collided with instead was Sunny's own will, which protected the Soul Devourer like an invisible aegis. Driven mad by the call of nightmare, straining to contain all the deathless and their ruler with the help of shadow manifestation, and resisting the will of the ancient tyrant, he could not help but let out a silent wail of mental anguish. Just stay still, for a bit more. Of course, Azarax was not going to heed his command. The deathless sovereign strained against his chains, gnashing his teeth in boundless fury. More and more of those chains snapped, allowing him to move a little. At first, he could only move his skull. So, Azarax bit into the chains, shattering them with his black teeth. Then, he slammed the back of his head into the trunk of the Soul Devourer, making the entire tree shudder. Deep cracks appeared on the bark of the colossal shade, gray fog flowing out of them like sap. Can't hold much longer. Azarax struck the death tree several more times, cracking its trunk while at the same time shattering his own helmet. Then, he managed to free one of his arms. When that happened, Sunny realized that his time had run out. Crap. Nevertheless, the Soul Devourer had served its purpose well. It stalled the deathless sovereign, while at the same time binding his undead warriors. Sunny escaped the shade of the death tree just before Azarax called upon his axe. The fearsome weapon flew through the air, spinning, and landed into his hand. A moment later, the glass blade flashed, and the remaining chains that bound him shattered. The ancient tyrant fell, landing on the sand with a resounding boom. As the sand that was thrown into the air by his landing was carried away by the wind, Sunny and Azarax found themselves facing each other, separated by no more than 100 meters. The terrifying conqueror of the ancient past gazed at Sunny with mad, boundless fury boiling in the depths of his empty eye sockets. Sunny, meanwhile, remained expressionless. He inhaled deeply. That should be enough time, I think. And as soon as he spoke it, before Azarax could lunge at him, the empty space behind him was suddenly not empty anymore. Instead, there was a magnificent black temple there, its towering pillars supporting the ancient black edifice. The temple that was almost as old as existence itself, built at the time the dream god had not yet become the forgotten god. The nameless temple. Not long before, the 7th incarnation of Sunny summoned the shade of the Soul Devourer behind Azarax. Then, he closed his eyes and delved into his soul sea, walking up the steps of the replica of the nameless temple to enter its great hall. Using the replica to connect to his citadel, Sunny then flooded it with his essence and summoned it to his side, bringing it to the heart of Ariel's hell from the eternal darkness of the Forgotten Shore. That incarnation was inside the nameless temple now, rushing to its underground part, where 2 items were contained within expansive runic circles, each emanating a chillingly malevolent aura. His target was one of those items. Azarax finally lunged forward, but he never reached Sunny. Instead, it was as if he struck an invisible wall. The fearsome great axe froze in the air, and the ancient tyrant himself staggered. He glanced up, a hint of wariness finding its way into his empty eyes, and then, his towering figure soared into the air, as if something enormous had grasped him and raised him up. That was the invisible guardian of the nameless temple, the last of them, and the only one that remained. Sunny still did not know anything about the nature of that being, including the true limits of its power. What he did know, however, was that it had existed from the dawn of time, having served the gods themselves once. During Sunny's first nightmare, the guardian allowed him entry into the nameless temple because of the mark of divinity etched into his soul, because it recognized the familiar scent of the gods upon him. It was for the same reason that it allowed the Mountain King inside, as well, because the soul of the Holy King who was corrupted by the Worm of Doubt thousands of years ago, the chrysalis of the puppeteer, had been infused with the flame of divinity too, once. Azarax, however, had nothing to do with the gods despite being a supreme being of immense power. If anything, he had actively antagonized the gods and all that was of them, deeming himself more worthy to sit on the throne of divinity than they. The invisible guardian served Sunny now, anyway. So, if Sunny wanted it to stall Azarax, it would do so without fail. The figure of Azarax was rising higher and higher, having long soared higher than the roof of the nameless temple. His indestructible glass armor was cracking and crumbling, sharp shards raining down like falling stars. Deep inside the transparent helmet, a thin fracture appeared on the black skull. Then, something flashed in the ancient tyrant's empty eye sockets, and he suddenly brandished his fearsome axe. There was a gust of hurricane wind, and the sandstorm was parted, revealing the ghastly battle between Nephis and the vast swarm of nightmare butterflies high above them. The sky was on fire, having turned into a blinding inferno of white flames. Suddenly free, Azarax fell to the ground and landed on one knee, using the great axe to support himself. Still motionless, Sunny pursed his lips. "You just refuse to give up, do you now?" Azarax glared at him, his killing intent potent enough to extinguish the life of lesser adversaries, and rose to his feet. It did not matter much, though, because at that moment, another avatar of Sunny walked between the pillars of the nameless temple, carrying something in his hands. He descended the black steps, stopped near Sunny, and carefully placed the item on the sand in front of him. Now, there was something between Sunny and Azarax, something that could stall the deathless sovereign for a long while, or perhaps even destroy him completely. Something that Sunny was very reluctant to use, but could not help but use now. The unsure way to deal with Azarax he had come up with. It was an old, intricately built dollhouse. The dollhouse he had taken from the Jade Palace and sealed in the underground hall of the Nameless Temple, deeming it too dangerous to be left in a city as populous as Ravenheart, or any city where mundane humans lived, for that matter. Sunny sighed. "Look what you made me do." He had been contemplating a way to deal with Azarax for a long while now. Sadly, the ancient tyrant was both immensely powerful and immortal, so there were not a lot of tricks that could help Sunny get rid of him. Initially, he had hoped to set the wandering archon on Azarax. Who was better suited to deal with the deathless sovereign than a deathless spirit, after all? However, the most likely reason Sunny would have needed to deal with Azarax was the curse of Shadow God. If the ancient tyrant lost himself to the curse, fully becoming one of the deathless, he would cease to be an ally and turn into a terrible threat. But that would also mean that the Archon and Azarax would be united in their impulse to destroy the invaders of the Hell of Ariel. If Sunny summoned the deathless spirit, they would attack him together instead of turning on each other, which would constitute a suboptimal result. So, this was the next best option. Or rather, the next worst option. As Azarax lunged at him from a distance, Sunny smiled darkly. "I would tell you to go to hell, but, you know, we are already here, so just go screw yourself, bastard. Meet the original Ash Tyrant." With that, he raised the serpent, poured all his will into its blade, and brought it down on the dollhouse, severing it in half. Suddenly, his hair stood on end, and a cold chill crept up his spine. The cursed tyrant was being set free to fight a cursed tyrant. That was quite ironic, actually. Unwilling to stay and see what would happen next, Sunny did something that he had never attempted before. He strained his soul and pulled the Nameless Temple into it, replacing the replica of the ancient citadel that stood in his soul sea with the real thing. Then, he stepped into the shadows and fled without ever looking back. The last thing he heard before disappearing from the vast expanse of white dunes was an eerie, chilling sound that made every bone in his body tremble, and every fiber of his being scream. Something told him that not looking back was a very wise and prudent decision on his part. Have fun, Azarax. The next moment, Sunny stepped out of the shadows onto the deck of the chain breaker. 2913 Nightmare Swarm. Somewhere far below, Azarax was engaged in a battle against the Ash Tyrant and two Ash Beasts, the ones Sunny, Kai, and Slayer had once replaced inside Ariel's game, and whom Seishin cleverly imprisoned in the dollhouse. Naturally, releasing at least one cursed nightmare creature into the world was nothing to be happy about. That said, there were no human settlements in Ariel's hell or anywhere near it, and even a cursed tyrant would find it difficult to escape the harrowing sea of white dunes. So, Sunny allowed himself to feel a hint of vindictive joy. His body was still in terrible pain after the short clash with the Deathless Sovereign, so he hoped that the bastard would feel some pain in his bones as well. Still kneeling on the deck of the chain breaker, Sunny gritted his teeth and pushed away the maddening litany of the call. Then, he tied the strip of white fabric Nephis had given him around his eyes, and only then stood up to evaluate the situation. It was difficult to understand what was happening around him from the chaotic movement of shadows, but Sunny managed to get the general picture. Damnation. The chain breaker was like a tiny island of purity in a vast and terrifying ocean of horrors, besieged from all sides and only a small mistake away from being destroyed at any given moment. The flying vessel was within the ghastly swarm of nightmare butterflies by now, ascending slowly. Saint had put its bottom parallel to the dark slope of the tomb of Ariel, no more than a few meters left between the two, so that it was protected at least from one side. It was as if the chain breaker was sailing on the endless, perfectly flat surface on black stone. As if it was sailing across a sea of nightmares. The giant nightmare butterflies swarmed all around it, but were kept at bay, for now, by the three defenders of the FLU-ing vessel. Nephis, the puppeteer, and Slayer were engaged in fierce battle against the swarm of great abominations, each straining to defend. 1/3 of the black sky. The sky where Nephis fought was a sea of white flames, the blinding light of the blessing breaking through the dark, swarming mass of horrid abominations from time to time. She was killing enough of them to rebuild her soul cores, but was going all out, burning and detonating the newly formed cores as soon as they were born, to kill more nightmare butterflies and repeat the process. The pain and agony of it all had to be ghastly, and she was struggling against the call at the same time. Sunny's heart was bleeding for her, but at the same time, the unimaginable scale of devastation she had unleashed was both traumatic and radiant. It seemed far beyond what a demigod was meant to be capable of, encroaching upon the authority of the divine. Watching her was like watching a goddess descend into hell to visit heavenly punishment upon the fiends who dwelled there, a stunning and awesome sight to behold. At the moment, though, Sunny was more interested in the other two defenders of the chain breaker. For no other reason than that they belonged to him, and therefore made him stronger with each great abomination they slayed. In the sky where the puppeteer fought, there was a vast and dreadful hurricane of billowing black silk. The titanic moth moved through the swarm, piercing and slicing the nightmare butterflies apart with its black threads. The puppeteer was also defending itself with the silk, while at the same time using its superior size and strength to rend the abominations apart. Sadly, its colossal size was both an advantage and a disadvantage in this fight. It allowed the great black moth to dominate the sky, yes, but it also made it easier for the nightmare butterflies to attack it. Already, the body of the puppeteer was shredded and battered, its enormous wings covered in gruesome rifts, its titanic silhouette shrouded in vast trails of ghostly fog. The puppeteer would be destroyed soon. It was not destroyed yet, though, and its sheer size prevented most of the abominations from reaching the chain breaker. In the sky where Slayer fought in her draconic form, slaughter and malevolence reigned. The black dragon moved among the nightmare butterflies that lunged at her, tearing at her obsidian scales, ripping them apart with her talons, her terrifying maw, and breaking their wings with her long and powerful tail. From time to time, torrents of lightless black flame escaped her maw with a dreadful roar, annihilating the great abominations. That flame was not really fire, but something else, something different, cold, but just as merciless and devastating. It had an insidious quality to it, biting into the flesh of the abominations, sapping them of life, and seemingly feeding on it, spreading until its prey shriveled and disintegrated into black dust. Slayer had entered this fight already battered and wounded, and now, she was even closer to being destroyed. However, that did not lessen her cold malice and bloodlust, and only made them more intense instead. It was as if the closer to true death she was, the more fearsome and ferocious she became. Just like she had been in the Shadow Realm, when she battled Sunny on the enormous shadow of condemnation. All three of the defenders of the chain breaker were astoundingly fearsome. But, still, their fearsome strength was not enough. Not nearly enough. The nightmare butterflies were already getting past them, diving toward the chain breaker. Saint had managed to evade them, for now, by steering the flying ship with steady precision, but she would not be able to keep it up much longer, because there were more and more abominations around her, and less space for her to maneuver. Luckily, Sunny was here now. Saint, his battered figure separated into 7 identical copies. One replaced Saint at the steering oars, while the other 6 prepared themselves for battle. At the same time, Sunny inhaled deeply and summoned the shades. The shades of the nightmare butterfly's slayer and the puppeteer had already slayed. They belonged to him now, after all. Just as another abomination dove toward the chain breaker, dozens of them, hundreds, perhaps, escaped from his shadow like a dark tide. They instantly tore the great monster apart and spread around the chain breaker, circling it like a tenebrous shield. Not bad for the start. That was the horror of the Shadow Legion. Everything Sunny or his servants killed became a part of it, and therefore, the longer a battle lasted, the stronger his army became. In theory, at least 100, or even 1,000, nightmare butterfly shades were not going to survive against millions of them, naturally. But they could at least buy the chain breaker a chance to make it inside the tomb of Ariel and reach the great river. So, Sunny had to endure the debilitating, harrowing cacophony of the call and concentrate on increasing the number of these eerie shades as quickly as possible. Saint had already crossed the sharply inclined deck and reached the tip of the flying vessel, summoning a bow as her cold gaze turned forward. With her long hair whipping in the wind, she raised her fearsome black bow and drew its string, taking aim at the nearest abomination. A black arrow struck the great monster in the head, and its entire giant body exploded into a cloud of viscera and black haze. Good idea. Steering the chain breaker, Sunny sent his 6 incarnations into battle. 2 summoned bows of their own, while 4 manifested wings with black, glistening feathers. Out of those 4, 2 manifested long spears and soared into the air, joining the nightmare butterfly shades that protected the flying ship. 2 more flew toward where Slayer was fighting deep within the swarm, one to augment her, one to fight by her side. Finally, Sunny commanded Serpent to assume the shape of The King of Swords and take position near the main mast of the chain break G, where the sacred tree grew from the wooden deck, to defend it with the dark swords it was able to control in that form. Now, we just need to hold fast. The question was, would they be able to? With each moment, the chain breaker was traveling higher across the endless black expanse of the tomb of Ariel. And each moment, it was moving deeper into the apocalyptic swarm of the nightmare butterflies. Only a small portion of them had swarmed out of the Great Pyramid, but even that amount was enough to wash over entire realms and obliterate them completely. One great abomination used to be a mythical threat, terrifying enough to eradicate all life on a populous continent. Thousands of them. Millions. The horror hidden inside the tomb of Ariel could wash and destroy not just any realm, but the dream realm itself, the dream realm, the waking world, and all of existence. Sunny and Nephis had been able to protect the chain breaker so far not because they were strong enough to contend against the vast cloud of the great abominations. It was simply because so far, the chain breaker had been flying through the outer edges of the descending swarm. Once the nightmare butterflies were upon them properly, Sunny froze for a moment, and then forced himself to continue fighting, pushing away the chilling feeling of despair that had crawled into his heart. What he was not able to push away, however, was the call, and the utter, animalistic horror that was slowly washing away his reason. Damn it, damn it, damn it. 2914 Dark Ascent. The horror he felt was not something that could be overcome by courage, bravery, or even by having a depth of experience facing harrowing things. Not even by being one of those things yourself. Because its source was not something that had a rational reason or could be overcome, to begin with. Instead, it was simply a natural reaction of a lesser being who found itself in the presence of the forgotten god, of Nightmare God, the god of corruption. The dreaming herald of the void. Even if what they were approaching was not the forgotten god himself but merely the seed of nightmare where he was imprisoned, lulled to slumber by the spell, their spirits simply could not resist being horrified. It was a fear that came not from their minds, bodies, or even souls. Instead, it was a fear that was born from the very essence of their beings, like an instinctual response that could not be controlled consciously. And it was growing more and more devastating the closer to the 7th seed they came. Sunny's hands trembled, making him miss a shot. Curses. He froze, momentarily overwhelmed by bestial panic. Then, with a groan, he forced himself to draw the bow again. The call, the seventh seed, the nightmare butterflies, come get me, damn it. I'll kill you all. In the depths of his half-broken, dazed state, Sunny fell back on something that had never failed him before. Spite. He was full of spiteful anger. The harder the world hit him, the angrier he was, the more he wanted to strike back. To make the world hurt just as much as it hurt him, no, more. 100 times more. So, that was what Sunny did. His groan turned into a growl. Grinding his teeth, he channeled his animalistic fear into wrath and aggression. Driven into a frenzy by the call, he made the nightmare butterflies a target of his frenzy instead of the seeds. Die, you bastards! Far away, one of his incarnations took Slayer into his dark embrace and joined her in the merciless, malevolent slaughter. Another avatar flew side by side with the abyssal black dragon, defending her from the nightmare butterflies that aimed to tear her apart. On the deck of the chain breaker, an avatar was deftly steering the ship. His eyes were still covered by the blindfold, but he managed just fine by relying on shadow sense. 4 other incarnations were fighting to protect the ship. 2 of them joined Saint as bowmen, while 2 more led the shades of the nightmare butterflies in the battle against their abominable kin. The higher the flying ship climbed, the more of the great nightmare creatures broke through the barrier of the 3 defenders, Nephis, Slayer, and the puppeteer. And the more those 3 defenders suffered, as well. How much longer? Sunny could not see how far they had risen, and was too afraid to extend his shadow sense upward to find the 4 titanic scars left on the surface of the tomb of Ariel by the claws of some unknown, unholy creature. But he knew that if they didn't reach those marks soon, they were going to die. The more nightmare butterflies he and those who served him killed, the more shades of those eerie creatures he could summon, and those shades, in turn, could kill more of their terrifying kind and conscript them in the Shadow Legion. That was how it was supposed to work in theory, at least, creating a vicious cycle. And it had worked, indeed, for a short while. But as the chain breaker dove into the depths of the terrifying swarm, things began to change. At first, there were simply more nightmare butterflies reaching Sunny and his shades. Sunny and Saint shot them out of the sky, while his 2 winged incarnations sliced those who survived apart, cutting through the hurricane winds raised by countless enormous wings beating chaotically. His shades tore apart the few that had gotten past him. None reached the chain breaker. However, as the density of the ghastly swarm increased and the 3 vanguards of the flying ship sustained more damage, the situation turned. The arrows Sunny and Saint sent into the swarm were like a drop in the ocean. His winged incarnations were drowning in a torrent of the great abominations, while his shades began to suffer casualties as well, because their kin fought back. He lost a few shades at first, then more. And then, slowly, he began to lose the shadow butterflies faster than new shades were being added to the Shadow Legion. By then, his winged incarnations were not eradicating the nightmare butterflies who had gotten through the 3 defenders, they were trying to survive in the flood of them instead. The first layer of defense around the chain breaker became ineffectual, the second was insufficient, and the third was barely holding on. It was only a matter of time before the first of the nightmare butterflies crashed into the chain breaker, leaving deep grooves on its wooden hull. Damn it! Sunny discarded his bow and jumped overboard, landing on the wing of the eerie creature. It took him no more than a second to slide down to its body and behead the eerie creature. But by then, another abomination was already plummeting onto the deck. That one was severed into 9 equal parts by the 7 black swords controlled by Serpent, but there were already more on the way. From that point forward, the battle against the swarm of nightmare butterflies turned from simply terrifying to desperate. And the call was growing louder. Sunny groaned, covering his ears. That cost him dearly. Far away, an incarnation of him that was fighting side by side with Slayer was a moment too slow to dodge a scythe-like limb of a nightmare butterfly. It struck him in the chest, where the jade-like metal of the mantle had already been damaged by Azarax. The armor held, just barely, but the impact was terrifying enough to damage his internal organs, a little. They were altered and improved by flesh weave, after all. But he was also tossed into the air and lost control of his flight as a result, failing to protect himself from another abomination. And when that one struck him, the mantle failed to stop the blow. The ghastly proboscis of the nightmare butterfly, a long, hollow, needle-like trunk that served them as mouths, pierced Sunny's chest and exited from his back, impaling him like a pinned insect. The damage was nearly fatal, or at least would have been to someone without a lineage. Even the tenacious nature of the weave, however, could not contend against the ghastly damage Sunny had received. His indestructible ribs were cracked and bent out of position, his lungs were completely destroyed, his heart was torn apart, and his spine was severely damaged. With blood streaming from his mouth, Sunny gritted his teeth and severed the proboscis, falling away from the reeling nightmare butterfly. The pain was manageable. The damage he sustained, however, was not. He had no choice but to push his mangled body toward Slayer and 2GN into a shadow, wrapping his mutilated incarnation around her. That was all that avatar of him could do now, unless he wanted to lose it. The other defenders of the chain breaker were not doing much better. Slayer was just as full of murderous malice as always, but her draconic body was now almost entirely shrouded in ghostly smoke that trailed from countless wounds on it. She had lost one of her eyes, and many fangs in her merciless maw had shattered. One of her mighty legs was viciously broken, black bones protruding from the shredded flesh, her fearsome claws hanging limp. Now, that broken limb was nothing but a useless burden that slowed her down. Twisting her body, Slayer bit into the uselessly dangling limb and tore it off in one vicious movement, burning it to ash before continuing the battle. Far away, the puppeteer was riddled with terrifying wounds, several nightmare butterflies crawling on his body, ripping those wounds wide open and delivering new ones. One of its wings was damaged, while the other was on the verge of being torn off. The storm of black silk that used to protect it was tattered and torn, as well, the abominations gnawing on the ethereal strings like locusts. And Nephis. Nephis had eradicated more of the nightmare butterflies than the rest of the defenders of the chain breaker combined, serving as the snowpiercer of their small aerial fleet. But it was not because she was overwhelmingly more powerful than the great abominations. She was of the same rank, after all, which meant that just like she could easily wound and destroy them, so could they wound and destroy her. Nephis could heal most of the wounds the butterflies dealt her, but if she was killed in one blow, no amount of white flame was going to save her. So, even if killing her instantly was a difficult task, she was only one mistake away from being destroyed. And when there were countless great abominations around her, each capable of ending her with one lucky strike, making a mistake was far too easy. Worse, she was also being driven mad by the call, just like Sunny. Her spirit was in the throes of primal fear, just like his, and on top of that, she had to endure the harrowing pain of her soul being burned to cinders and restored from the ash anew, torn apart and mended by flame OVG and over again without a single moment of respite. All that crushing torment was more than enough to burn away anyone's mind and break them, or change them into something new and unrecognizable, something awesome and unstoppable. Nephis had not been stopped yet, but she was not unstoppable, either. Even as she burned a path to the top of the pyramid, her melodious voice thundering the names of flame and destruction from the burning sky, her essence was swiftly dwindling. She had been able to replenish it swiftly at first by destroying her soul cores, but soon enough, even that stopped being enough to make up for the essence she was spending to destroy the nightmare butterflies. Nephis was approaching the state of complete essence exhaustion. And if she did, even her dormant ability would fall into a slumber, prohibiting her from mending the horrible wounds dealt to her by the endless abominations and by her own fiery aspect. That moment was approaching swiftly,